business anyway. There was no offering for a man in it without capital. So he was thinking, his head bent as he rode up a long slope of grassy hill. At the top he stopped to blow old Whetstone a little, turning in the saddle, running his eyes casually along the fence. He started, his dreams gone from him like a covey of frightened quail. The fence was cut. For 100 yards or more along the hilltop, it was cut at every post, making it impossible to piece. Lambert could not have felt his resentment burn any hotter if it had been his own fence. It was a fence under his charge. The defiance was directed at him. He rode along to see if any cattle had escaped, and drew his breath again with relief when he found that none had passed. There was the track of but one horse. The fence cutter had been alone, probably not more than an hour ahead of him. The job finished, he had gone boldly in the direction of Kerr's ranch, on whose side the depredation had been committed. Lambert followed the trail some distance. It led on toward Kerr's ranch. Defiance in its very boldness. Kerr himself must have done the job. One man had little chance of stopping such assaults. Now they had begun, on a front of 20 miles. But Lambert vowed that if he ever did have the good fortune to come up on one of these sneaks while he was at work, he'd fill his hide so full of lead they'd have to get a derrick to load him on a wagon. Didn't matter so much about the fence, so long as they didn't get any of the stock. But stragglers from the main herd would find a big gap like that in a few hours, and the rustlers lying in wait would hurry them away. One such loss as that, and he would be a disgraced man in the eyes of Vesta Philbrook, and the laughing stock of the rascals who put it through. He rode in search of the Iowa boy who was with the cattle, his job being to ride among them continually to keep them accustomed to a man on horseback. Luckily, he found him before sundown and sent him for wire. Then he stood guard at the cut until the damage was repaired. After that, fence cutting became a regular prank on Kerr's side of the ranch. Watch as he might, Lambert could not prevent the stealthy excursions and vindictive destruction of the hated barrier. All these breaches were made within a mile on either side of the first cut, sometimes in a single place, again along a stretch, as if the person using the nippers knew when to deliberate and when to hasten. Always there was the trace of but one rider, who never dismounted to cut even the bottom wire. That was the work of the same person each time, Lambert was convinced, for he always rode the same horse, as betrayed by a broken hind hoof. Lambert tried various expedients for trapping the skulker. During a period of 2 weeks, he lay in wait by day and made stealthy excursions by night, all to no avail. Whoever was doing it had some way of keeping informed on his movements with exasperating closeness. The matter of discovering and punishing the culprit devolved on Lambert alone. He could not withdraw Taterleg to help him, the other man could not be spared from the cattle, and now came the crowning insult of all. It was early morning, after an all-night watch along the 3 miles of fence where the wire cutter always worked, when Lambert rode to the top of the ridge where the first breach in his line had been made. Below that point, not more than half a mile, he had stopped to boil his breakfast coffee. His first discovery on mounting the ridge was a panel of fence cut. His next, a piece of white paper twisted to the end of one of the curling wires. This he disengaged and unfolded. It was a page torn from a medicine memorandum book, such as cowpunchers usually carry their time in, and the addresses of friends. "Why don't you come and get me, Mr. Duke?" This was the message it bore. The writing was better, the spelling more exact than the output of the ordinary cowpuncher. Kerr himself, Lambert thought again. He stood with the taunting message in his fingers, looking toward the Kerr ranch house, some 7 or 8 miles to the south, and stood so quite a while, his eyes drawn small as he looked into the wind. "All right, I'll take you up on that," he said. He rode slowly out through the gap, following the fresh trail as before. It was made by the horse with the notch in his left hind hoof. It led to a hill 3/4 of a mile beyond the fence. From this point it struck a line for the distant ranch house. Lambert did not go beyond the hill. Dismounting, He stood surveying the country about him, struck for the first time by the view of this vantage point afforded of the domain under his care. Especially the line of fence was plainly marked for a long distance on either side of the little ridge where the last cut had been made. Evidently the skulker concealed himself at this very point and watched his opening, playing entirely safe. That accounted for all the cutting having been done by daylight, as he was sure had been the case. He looked about for trace of where the fellow had lain behind the fringe of sage, but the ground was so hard that it would not take a human footprint. As he looked, he formulated a plan of his own. Half a mile or more beyond this hill, in the direction of the Kerr place, a small butte stood up, its steep sides grassless, its flat top bare. That would be his watchtower from that day forward until he had his hand on this defiant rascal, who had time, in his security, to stop and write a note. That night he scaled the little butte after mending the fence behind him, leaving his horse concealed among the huge blocks of rock at its foot. Next day, and the one following, he passed in the blazing sun, but nobody came to cut the fence. At night he went down, rode his horse to water, turned him to graze, and went back to his perch among the ants and lizards on top of the butte. The third day was cloudy and uneventful. On the fourth, a little before 9, just when the sun was squaring off to shrivel him in his skin, Lambert saw somebody coming from the direction of Kerr's ranch. The rider made straight for the hill below Lambert's butte, where he reined up before reaching the top, dismounted, and went crawling to the fringe of sage at the further rim of the bare summit. Lambert waited until a fellow mounted and rode toward the fence. Then he slid down the shale, startling Whetstone from his doze. Lambert calculated that he was more than a mile from the fence. He wanted to get over there near enough to catch the fellow at work, so there would be full justification for what he intended to do. Whetstone stretched himself to the task, coming out of the broken ground and up the hill from which the fence-cutter had ridden but a few minutes before, while the marauder was still a considerable distance from his objective. The man was riding slowly, as if saving his horse for a chance surprise. Lambert cut down the distance between them rapidly and was not more than 300 yards behind when the fellow began snipping the wire with a pair of nippers that glittered in the sun. Lambert held his horse back, approaching with little noise. The fence-cutter was rising back to the saddle after cutting the bottom wire of the second panel when he saw that he was trapped. Plainly unnerved by this coup of the despised fence-guard, he sat clutching his reins as if calculating his chance of dashing past the man who blocked his retreat. Lambert slowed down, not more than 50 yards between them, waiting for the first move toward a gun. He wanted as much of the law on his side, even though there was no witness to it. He could have, for the sake of his conscience and his peace. Just a moment the fence-cutter hesitated, making no movement to pull a gun. Then he seemed to decide in a flash that he could not escape the way that he had come. He leaned low over his horse's neck as if he expected Lambert to begin shooting, rode through the gap that he had cut in the fence, and galloped swiftly into the pasture. Lambert followed, sensing the scheme at a glance. The rascal intended to either ride across the pasture, hoping to outrun his pursuer in the 3 miles of up-and-down country, or turn when he had a safe lead and go back. As the chase led away, it became plain that the plan was to make a run for the further fence, cut it, and get away before Lambert could come up. That arrangement suited Lambert admirably. It would seem to give him all the law on his side that any man could ask. There was a scrubby growth of brush on the hillside, and tall red willows along the streams, making a covert here and there for a horse. The fleeing man took advantage of every offering of this nature, as if he rode in constant fear of the bullet that he knew was his due. Added to this cunning, he was well mounted, his horse being almost equal in speed to Whetstone, it seemed, at the beginning of the race. Lambert pushed him as hard as he thought wise, conserving his horse for the advantage that he knew he would have while the fence-cutter stopped to make himself an outlet. The fellow rode hard, unsparing of his quirt, jumping his long-legged horse over rocks and across ravines. It was in one of those leaps that Lambert saw something fall from the saddle holster. He found it to be the nippers with which the fence had been cut, lying in the bottom of a deep arroyo. He rode down and recovered the tool in no